After World War II, the world moves into the Cold War, which is where America and its allies compete with the Soviet Union and its allies to influence the world, with communism attempting to spread throughout the world. America and the Soviet Union had been allies during the war against the Nazis, but soon after the Nazis are conquered, it becomes apparent that the Soviet Union is competing with America. Um, so the Cold War is a war around the world. We call it the Cold War because America and the Soviet Union never directly fight each other, although they do attack each other through third parties. It lasts from the end of World War II until 1991 when the Soviet Union collapses. You often hear from academics talk about the Cold War being good and bad on both sides. That they'll often use the term moral equivalence. That both sides were equally to blame for the Cold War, for allies becoming opponents, and that both sides did good and bad. I think that's absolutely and obviously wrong. I think it's rare that you'll find such obvious examples of good versus bad, black and white. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys. They're trying to spread communism, we're trying to prevent it. There are going to be some bad stuff. There is going to be some bad stuff America does and our allies do. Whenever you're dealing with the real world, you're going to sometimes have to ally with people who are unsavory, whom you wouldn't normally ally with. But that's just the nature of the thing. And whenever you've got real people involved, you're going to have bad stuff done, even by Americans. But overall, there's no doubt that America is fighting for freedom and capitalism, which means freedom and prosperity. The Soviet Union fighting to spread communism. And let's just remember what these people are like, our opponents. So you remember the Ukraine famine, where Stalin on purpose starved to death 3 to 7 million people. And again, we're going to see, like we saw back here, with the media trying to take the side of the Soviet Union. Remember, Pulitzer Prize winner covers up the Ukraine famine. We often see the media try to take the side of the communists, or at least try to treat it as if America and the Soviet Union were equally to blame. Not always the case, but unfortunately often the case with the media. But these are the people we're opposing. 3 to 7 million starved on purpose. Remember, the founder of the Soviet Union, Lenin, you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. If you're going to bring in the great utopia of communism, you're just going to have to kill some people. Let's see just one example of where we see a stark contrast between the two opponents. So this is a satellite picture of the Korean Peninsula. And obviously what you see at night, you see electricity in the south, you see darkness in the north because they're poor. They're so poor. You've got famine, but it's not just poverty and famine, people starving to death. It's also lack of freedom. We're not exactly sure what's going on in North Korea because they're not free. They don't have freedom of speech. They don't have freedom of the press. The country is a giant prison camp. So what you have in South Korea, you've got one of the most prosperous, freest, most wonderful places to live in the history of the world. North Korea, you've got one of the worst places to live in the history of the world. Whose side who took North Korea's side? The Soviet Union and then the Chinese communists. Who took South Korea's side? America. It is very clear. As we'll see when we talk about the Korean War, if America hadn't stepped in, the whole peninsula would be black. If China hadn't stepped in during the Korean War, the whole peninsula would look like South Korea. Very clear. Good guys and bad guys. We are responsible for South Korea being so free and prosperous. The communists are responsible for North Korea's horror. And we'll see other examples of this. Where people say, well, who knows, communism, capitalism, they're just different theories. We put them into practice. We have unplanned experiments. You take the exact same people, split them in half, communism on one side, capitalism on the other, and there's no doubt which is better. And if you say, well, that's just what you say because you're American, okay, the people themselves, let them choose. And what do they choose? Do you see anyone trying to escape into North Korea? How about Cuba? Anybody try to sneak into Cuba? During the communist bloc, when the Soviet Union was ruling Eastern Europe, you had people literally risking their lives, literally dying to get out of the Soviet bloc, the communist bloc. And they had to line up machine guns to shoot people to keep them in. You've got East and West Germany split, you've got East and West Berlin split, and each time on the capitalist side, you've got freedom and prosperity. Communist side, there's no comparison, poverty and slavery. Uh, Decades after the end of World War II, you could walk around East Berlin and still see buildings that hadn't been repaired since World War II. West Berlin, just the other side of the wall, you see one of the most advanced cities in the history of the world. Capitalism works, communism doesn't. And this, by the way, when even though East Germany was the richest country in the communist bloc. So not only do we have famine going on in North Korea, but you've got people being killed. You've got lack of freedom. We've got, from reports we've got of people who've snuck out, you've got people eating grass, that there are no rats in Pyongyang because people are eating them to try to survive. Thank you, communism. Soviet Union on one side, America, without its help, South Korea would have been conquered and in the same situation as North Korea. So how did this all begin? We ended up we started the Cold War with Europe getting split in half. Europe and Germany and Berlin. As the Soviet Union invaded the Nazi Empire from the east, it started pushing back. And remember, it was the Soviets, of course, that killed the vast number of Nazis. Eventually, America started the second front that Stalin had been demanding, invading in northwest France, and America started pushing in from the west. Once the Nazis had been defeated and we denazified Europe, wherever America had taken over, we let those countries decide for themselves what future they would have, but they became our allies, most of them. The Soviet Union, wherever they conquered, they stayed and they kept control. And so eventually became clear you've got an Eastern Europe under the control of the Soviets, Western Europe under the influence of America. And I say control versus influence because, yeah, America did put pressure on countries to follow our lead. We would say, well, we're not going to give you defense money, things like that. But they could still choose what they wanted to do. They would often say bad things about us. France decided to not be in NATO anymore. They could make their own decisions. In Eastern Europe, when they tried that, the Soviet Union would roll in the tanks. So we get Europe, Germany, and Berlin split east and west. We'll see in Korea it gets split north and south. So, as I've shown, once the Soviets, wherever they had conquered, they stay in place. And that's why you've got on the eastern side in pink, you've got the Warsaw Pact nations. That's the alliance group. In the west, in green, you've got the North Atlantic Treaty Organization groups backed by America. We'll talk about NATO a little later. Those are the forces allied with America. And then you see, as we denazified Germany, we split Germany into occupation zones, and each one of the major allies got a region to be in control of. Eventually, America, Britain, and France decided, okay, we're going home. We're going to put Germany in charge of itself. But Russia didn't leave, and they kept control. However, within Berlin, you see that Berlin is in the eastern part of Germany. The capital had also been split into occupation zones between the different allies, and it also gets split east and west. You see that little blue part inside of East Germany. So Berlin gets split as well. So we'll talk about each of these as we go. We're going to focus in. We're going to talk about the Berlin blockade. We'll see how important that split is in a little while. Okay, yeah, there's Berlin inside of East Germany. And one of the results, one example of this distinction between freedom and oppression is a couple decades into the Cold War. So many people are fleeing the oppression of the communists and fleeing to freedom that it's a huge embarrassment. And the Soviet Union decides to order a wall be built between East and West Berlin. And here's a picture of relatives who got divided by that wall. This experience you could multiply by the millions. The oppression, the families broken up, thanks to the oppression of the Soviet Union. That's what we're opposing. So Now I'm into your notes. I'm in the first unit. Soviet Union doesn't follow through with its commitments. The Soviet Union is a former Russia, now that became the Soviet Union, that had conquered other places beyond Russia, made them part of the Soviet Union, and then brought in all these other countries you see in pink under their control. So the theme of the beginning of this series in the Cold War is going to be on, was there moral equivalence? Were both sides equally to blame? That's going to be your essay or short answer question, and you need to be prepared for that. And my emphatic answer is absolutely not. And so we're going to look at first phase. The Soviets don't follow through with their commitments. Then we'll talk about how America finally wakes up. So during World War II, the two sides had agreed to a declaration on liberated Europe. Stalin had said that uh, he'd agreed to the idea that all countries um, that had been freed from the Nazis would have the right of all people to choose the form of government under which they live. We both agreed to that. However, eventually, America decided to leave. In line with the American commitment to that declaration, we started pulling out. And that was the plan all along. Franklin Roosevelt had the conviction that he could depend on Stalin's benevolence to do their part of the agreement to pull out. So as soon as it was clear that the Soviet Union, that the Nazis were conquered, we were going to defeat Germany, then move on to the Pacific, beat Japan, and then go home as quickly as possible. The UN was to do the rest. That was the agreement made during World War II. Again, that was the document, a declaration on a liberated Europe. And that was the theme of it. However, I'm first going to talk about the attitudes of the two sides, then talk about their actions. Was it ever Stalin's intention to let this happen? No. And we see at the Potsdam Conference, 1945, that Stalin made it clear these countries they've conquered are not going to be free because they're going to call them anti-Soviet, and so the countries they took over, they're going to keep control over. Now, some people will say, well, isn't it understandable the Soviet Union needed a buffer because, hey, they've been invaded by Germany twice. Um, hmm. Yeah, I can see them being nervous about getting invaded again, but was it Hungary that invaded them? Was it Romania? How about the Baltic states? Right? Are they afraid the Baltic Ocean's going to invade? How about Finland? There was problems with they had disagreements about the Finnish Civil War. I'm just not buying that this was just fear of their getting invaded. It was the Nazis who'd invaded, not all these other countries. And couldn't there be some more understandable way of protecting themselves than enslaving half a continent for half a century? Um, so it became clear very soon that the Soviet Union had no intention of cooperating. How about the Americans? What was their attitude? Well, uh, Franklin Roosevelt thought that he could cooperate with the Soviets. He was basically, it's just obvious, he was manipulated by Stalin. Um, I'm not sure there was too much he could do, although I think maybe some of the places he could have done more. But the Soviet Union just had a lot more tanks. But it's pretty clear that Franklin Roosevelt was naive in his dealings with Stalin. And let's just take a look at some of the quotes. Yeah, this is an actual quote from Franklin Roosevelt. It's it's like middle school girls gossiping. I mean, it's hard to believe he would actually be thinking this about. Remember, this is Stalin who's responsible for the deaths of millions and millions of people, and FDR's. I think he likes me better. Okay. How about this? This is his approach. Yeah, that's his approach to dealing with Stalin. Yeah, unbelievably naive. But what FDR gave to Stalin over Churchill's protest, Churchill saw what was really going on and tried to warn FDR. What FDR gave to Stalin was not his to give. And at the time, we now know that there was a spy working in his staff during the talks with Stalin. Stalin knew everything that was going on inside FDR's staff. And by the way, the guy who would later try to expose this spy, of course, the media would attack him. But maybe we can talk about that another time. FDR even refused to back the British demand for an international team to supervise the elections that Stalin had promised, because he was content with Stalin's assurance that, quote, all democratic and anti-Nazi parties shall have the right to take part. Remember, this is the guy who killed 20 million, maybe more, of his own people. And here, of course, I've got a picture of Ukrainians that in the 3 to 7 million starved to death on purpose. And how about this? For our ambassador to the Soviet Union, when Truman became president after FDR died, this was his admonition to him. This is the attitude the American leadership had toward the Soviets. It does not sound like a force that wants to try to conquer the Soviet Union. Okay, as we know, after FDR died, Truman took over. He wanted to cooperate. He thought Stalin was a crook, but he'd worked in politics for decades. He knew how to deal with crooks, and many people believed that Truman was actually trustworthy because he came from a state with a very powerful political machine, and he actually wasn't rich. So that seemed to be a sign that he was trustworthy. But he was used to dealing with crooks, and he thought, hey, I can deal with this guy. And when we look at his private papers, public announcements, okay, it's going to be propaganda. But what did his private papers show? Clearly that he was eager to work with Stalin in a fair and honest way. Now, we shouldn't be too harsh on FDR. Most Americans felt this way. The American people were not eager to move from war with the Germans to a war with, or a showdown even, with the Soviet Union. Our overwhelming desire for a return to normal life was the chief cause of our woes following World War II. After years of war, few individuals looked forward to trouble in foreign affairs. Everybody wanted to enjoy the post-war domestic tranquility to the hilt. And remember, before World War II, we had the Great Depression. So people are like, let's just get back to living our lives and have the good life. And again, remember, almost all Americans in 1945 thought the Soviets would be peaceful and easy to get along with. Hopes that the Soviet Union would be easy to get along with were encouraged by the communist rhetoric calling for, they believe the communist rhetoric calling for worldwide revolution they'd seen so much of had been subsumed during the war by traditional Russian patriotism, and that would encourage their traditional closeness with the West. Ideas like containment that we'll talk about later, Cold War, that was foreign to American wartime hopes and were not talked of by the people or the statesmen of the U.S. until 1947 and thereafter, when Soviet actions had forced them to see the reality of what the Soviets were really like. When the true Soviet intentions became all too clear, it was almost too late to do anything. See, Americans want to get back and have families, have their jobs. They didn't want to stay in the military and stop the Soviets. And also, you got to remember, we actually had propaganda in America because these were our allies, and we didn't want people thinking we were allying with somebody horrible. So we had censorship of things, of people saying bad things about the Soviet Union. We had propaganda calling Stalin Uncle Joe. Americans were not eager to be enemies with the Soviet Union. So that was the attitudes of the two sides. Let's talk about the actions of the two sides. First, we'll talk about during the war. What did America do during the war? Then what did America do after the war? Then we'll contrast that with the Soviets. So during the war, we bypassed opportunities to limit the Soviets. So as the Soviets are coming in from the east, America's coming in from the west. So we had two options. You could go with a broad front or a narrow front, and we chose a broad front. That's a sign that we really did want to just, our focus was not taking land from the Soviets, being enemies with the Soviets. Our focus was conquering the Nazis, and we believe we were allies with the Soviets. So during the war, we're showing we want to work with the Soviets and we just want to stop the Nazis. So what do I mean by a front? So here you see in dark blue, you see what a narrow front would look like. Okay, so if you focused your forces, you could push through the enemy and you could go fairly quickly because your forces are concentrated. So if we wanted to get east as quickly as possible, and this is something Churchill hoped we would do, have a narrow front. What would that enable us to do? Punch through the Germans as quickly as possible, get east as quickly as possible. Why? Why would Churchill want to do that? Because he knew the Soviets were going to end up being our enemies after World War II, and he wanted to keep as much land out of their hands as possible. And he knew anywhere the Soviets were, those people would be kept enslaved. So let's free those people by shooting east as quickly as possible. The danger with that, there I go. The idea that if we shot east quickly, we could push the border between the America and its allies east much further if we went quickly. Okay, maybe we could have kept much of Eastern Europe into the hands of freedom if we had a narrow front. The problem with that approach, oh yeah, there we go, freedom, right? Keep those guys in freedom. Uh, the problem with that approach is it could have enabled the Nazis to go around us, cut off our forces, and it would have been much more dangerous. So a narrow front would be quick, grabbing more land for us, keeping out of the hands of the Soviets, but it would be dangerous. A broad front, you see this now uh, much more widely spread front. The front again is where all the fighting is going on. A broad front um, would go slower, but it would be safer. The Nazis wouldn't be able to get around us, and that would prevent American casualties and keep us safe. However, as I said, it means we would go much more slowly, which means the Soviets were able to expand forward, and instead of us keep saving Europe for freedom, the communists would keep all that land in slavery. So we chose a broad front, which again is evidence that we're not thinking about, hey, let's be opponents to the Soviets. Let's keep land. Let's grab stuff to keep it out of their hands. As Eisenhower said, I would be loath to hazard American lives for purely political purposes. He refused to coordinate tactics with the British to limit the Soviet advance. He said he did not wish to feed Soviet suspicions that the British and Americans would be operating in concert against them. So if our goal was to compete the Soviets, which would we have done? Obviously, a narrow front to keep land out of their hands. We did a broad front, which I think shows we were not out to compete with the Soviets. We were not wanting to start a Cold War. It's going to be triggered by them. Another piece of evidence that America is not trying to just compete with the Soviets, see them as enemies, and take land from them. We had made plans during the Yalta conference of who's going to go where when we're conquering the Nazis. But plans don't necessarily work out the way we'd exactly expect them in the real world. And there were some places where America had gone beyond the areas that had been allotted to us by the Yalta Agreement. So we actually pull back and let the Soviets take that area. Does that sound like somebody who is trying to compete with the Soviets? No. We were trying to work with the Soviets, follow through with our agreements. The Soviets, we will soon find out, are going to say the exact opposite. Hey, whoever's got troops there, they're in charge in that area. What are you going to do about it? So Americans voluntarily withdraw from some areas, again, showing we wanted to work with the Soviets. So how about after the war? What does America do after the war? Do we take steps that seem to indicate we're a huge threat to the Soviets? No. First of all, we demobilized, and that just means we shrank our military. Okay? Not long after the war, America, this is what we do after every war, right? We win the war, and then what do? We shut down the military. Remember, this is a venerable American tradition, we don't like a big standing military. Now, that may seem weird to you because we've got a very big, powerful military today. That is really going to be the product of the Cold War. And maybe we need to wake up and say, why do we have troops all over the world? That's not what the founders intended, and that's not what we're going to have until basically the Cold War drags us into that. So, anyway, right after World War II, America shrinks. And this is how many divisions the two forces have. The Soviets didn't shrink theirs. Down one and a third versus 260. Okay, and really, Truman didn't have any choice but to demobilize. Look at the systems the two leaders were in. Right? Truman, he did want to demobilize, but what if he hadn't? What if he had wanted to control all of Western Europe and keep all that power for America? Right? Well, remember, American soldiers, they don't want to be soldiers. They want to go home to their families. They want to live the good life. They want to have a job. They don't want to stay in the military anymore. They don't want to stay away from their homes. And if Truman had not let them demobilize, he would have been canned really quickly next time we have an election. Now, do you think the Soviet soldiers wanted to go home? Sure. Do you think they're going to tell Stalin that? No, tough. You've got the forces of freedom because they're free, because it's a real democracy. He's going to have to demobilize. Stalin, on the other hand, they're not free. He can do what he wants, and the soldiers are just going to have to put up with it. They keep their military big and powerful and are able to control Europe with it. Also, the next action that shows that America is not a huge threat to the Soviet Union, we actually started leaving. We started pulling out, and one diplomat with Soviet experience stated in 1945, half and maybe all of Europe might be communist by the end of next winter. This is what we're doing. We're following through with our plans to leave Europe until Stalin's greed finally woke us up. Now, let's contrast those actions of America. We're trying to see, was there moral equivalence, both sides equally to blame for the Cold War? America shrinking our military, pulling out, letting these countries that we had freed from the Nazis have take themselves. Remember, we let the French free forces, we let them free Paris, okay, and then we let the French rule France. Is that what the Soviet Union's going to do? So let's talk first about during the war, then after the war, to see, does it look like the Soviet Union is a partner that can be trusted? Okay. Well, first of all, can you trust somebody who makes a pact with the Nazis? Remember this. At the beginning of World War II, okay, Stalin had made a pact with Hitler to split Poland. Even though communists and Nazis were supposedly mortal enemies, which I'm not sure I completely buy that. Remember, I think they're much more close to each other than either is close to America's limited government. But supposedly there were mortal enemies, and yet Stalin had made a pact with Hitler to split Poland. And again, when people say, "Oh, it's understandable," they kept that buffer, those buffer countries, they're worried about getting invaded. Well, if he's really worried about Germany invading, why didn't he help Poland against the invaders? And by the way, got a good book on the Russian Revolution. Just ask me who it is if you're interested. That shows very clearly the Soviet Union was helping Germany rearm, giving them equipment and exchanging military information. The Soviets actually helped the Germans build up their military. So, first of all, this doesn't seem like somebody we can trust. Somebody who made a pact with Hitler and then grabbed half of Poland. And if you're worried about creating a buffer state to make sure you're not getting invaded, why don't you create alliances with these other countries instead of conquering them? Another act that I think shows that they weren't to be trusted and they were just out to grab power, the Warsaw Uprising. The Soviet Union betrayed the Warsaw Uprising. As the Soviet troops are moving into Poland and they're getting near Warsaw, Polish independent forces rose up against the Nazis. And you see the little blue spot there by the big Soviet arrow. By the way, I put both arrows in blue because at this point we're allies. Okay, so but as you're getting close to that little blue spot represents Warsaw. The Polish Independence Free Forces rose up and fought against the Nazis. Well, Stalin believed these independent forces would pose a threat to his rule over Poland after World War II. I mean, if they're willing to fight the Nazis, hey, maybe they'll also be willing to fight him, he believed. Consequently, now if all the Soviets were caring about was just beating the Nazis, what would you expect them to do? They would help. They would send aid. They would coordinate and attack the Nazis while the Nazis are attacking them. What do they do instead? They pause. They stop and waited for the Germans to wipe out the uprising. The other side of a river, they can even hear the shots being fired, and they do nothing to help. There was even an air field nearby the Americans wanted to use to resupply the Polish from, and the Soviets said no. We do try to resupply them once. Unfortunately, this is not an exact science, and about 80% of what we dropped went to the Nazis. This showed that Stalin was bargaining in bad faith with FDR when he promised to allow free elections after the war. During the war, he's already planning for these elections. He doesn't want anybody who could be a threat to his power. And by the way, we saw this in his own country. One of the reasons the Soviet Union did so horribly when the Nazis first invaded is Stalin had already killed so many of his officers, people who'd fought valiantly for him during the Russian Civil War. Good movie I've mentioned before called Burnt by the Sun, made by a Russian. This guy who's a real believer in communism, and then he gets betrayed by Stalin. He's gonna take out anybody who might be a threat to his power. A little bit more about the Warsaw Uprising. What are the saddest events of world history? So here is some of the fighting going on. Um, Here's an example of them rigging up an old Chevy van with armor to make an armored car. And here's some examples of some weapons mass produced covertly in Europe that they used to fight the Nazis. This is the desperation with which they're fighting. Um, from what I have read, some of the best soldiers they had were actually Boy Scouts, the Gray Ranks, and they fought valiantly. And what did the Soviets do to help? Nothing. They sit back. And eventually, when the Nazis come forward with the women in front of their tanks, so that the Polish are afraid to fight, that's one of the many tactics they use. And when they're finally overwhelmed, the people remaining in Warsaw are kicked out, their homes burned down, and almost all of Warsaw is completely destroyed. If you go to Warsaw today, what you're seeing is almost all of it is just rebuilt since World War II, meant to look like what the original buildings looked like. And then some of them get sent to concentration camps. Here is an example of Jewish prisoners. There was a small concentration camp inside Warsaw, and they freed these people, and then those concentration camp survivors end up helping to fight the Nazis. The Soviet Union doesn't help. So they wait for the Nazis to put down that uprising, and it is quashed. Then the Soviets come through. Oh, here's an example. One of the big advantages the Nazis had was they had some aircraft. The Soviets, I believe, had an air force that could have taken them out, but they sit back. And if you've got air superiority, that's a huge advantage if you can drop bombs on your enemy. And the Polish free forces had no anti-aircraft guns. They were completely at the mercy of these bombers. And again, the Soviets did nothing to help. Here is an example of a home soldier who is finally surrendering to the German troops. Coming out of one of the ways they were able to get around was through the sewage. And here's a report from the German military that the final resistance was crushed. They fought to the very last bullet. And the Soviets did nothing to help. Another example of the Soviets, says Soviets betray. Should just say Soviets invade Finland. He didn't just invade Poland, and he also invaded Finland. So several examples, I think, of why there wasn't moral equivalence. The two sides were not equal. What else did they do? Well, after the war, so that was during the war, showing that they couldn't be trusted, that the two sides were not both equally just fighting for freedom. What did they do after the war? The Soviets created puppet states. A state is a government, a country. A puppet, obviously, what this means is the Soviet Union. These are countries in name, like Poland and Czechoslovakia, Hungary, but they're controlled by the Soviet Union. They can't have a foreign policy of their own. They can't make all this. They have some freedom to make their own decisions, but they always had to think what would the Soviet Union want them to do. And anytime they decide we're going to be free and make our own decisions, there's always the threat, which would often come true, of the Soviet Union sending in the tanks. So they would put into place leaders who would always follow the dictates of Moscow. So also we could call these puppet states satellites. A satellite is a body that revolves around another. So these satellite countries, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, they revolve around what the Soviet Union wants them to do. Did America have satellites? Yeah, we had people we influenced, right? We took the lead, but they didn't have to do exactly what we wanted. Um, they could make their own decisions. Again, France would eventually leave NATO, um, and we weren't in charge of their elections. So we would influence them and put pressure on them for sure to get them to fall in line with what we wanted, but not nearly the same of the Soviet Union complete control. So they did not start withdrawing troops like America did. They did not allow free elections as they'd promised. In fact, they'd kill anybody who was for liberty. Um, they would conduct show trials. So if you were somebody who spoke up against the Soviets, they'd put you on trial and force you to confess to doing all these horrible things and then put you to death. That's a show trial. If you've ever read 1984, he gets his ideas from his experience in the Spanish Civil War dealing with the people backed by the communists. Um, so in some instances, if you were for independence for your country, you'd just disappear if you were seen with a foreigner even. Result: areas that we controlled after kicking out the Nazis, where American soldiers were self-determined. They actually had democracy and freedom. Areas the Soviets possessed were Moscow determined. 9 previously independent countries, plus half of Germany, had been lost to freedom and democracy for a generation. Later on, they would crush any uprisings of people trying to regain their freedom, and we would do nothing. Now, the reason we would do nothing is obviously at this point, we got to bring nukes into the picture, and we're afraid if we try to do anything to support one of these countries, it might become a nuclear exchange. So, for example, Hungary, when the people called for independence, Soviet troops and tanks suppressed the insurgents. Hundreds of Hungarians were executed, thousands more were imprisoned, about 200,000 fled the country. 1958, Poland. When Poland started talking about independence, that was severely repressed. Czechoslovakia, 1968. Few were killed, but the leaders were imprisoned. The leaders of the uprising were killed or ejected from the country. And that's not all. The Soviets would also back armed coups. A coup is where a small group tries to take over a country. Places where they didn't already have armies, they would try to back coups. They prepared coups for Greece, if you look down in the southern part of Europe, Greece, Turkey, Italy. And of course, they will help, as we'll see later, they will help North Korea invade South Korea to make it communist. So they're not only going to keep what they got, they're hoping to spread more. 1947, the Soviets established Cominform, a committee whose main purpose was to instigate revolutions around the world, and their actions seemed to fall in line with this heated rhetoric. There actually was a vast international communist conspiracy to turn the whole world communistic. Throughout all of this, when we're trying to work with them, there was diplomatic intransigence. So diplomacy is when you try to have relations with other country, and transigence when somebody just won't cooperate. It's a one-way street. They will always demand and demand and demand and never cooperate with us. Repeatedly, our diplomats would show up wanting to work with the Soviets and get treated the way North Korea works with us today. Just making absolute demands and giving in nothing. It's telling that the first people to wake up to the true nature of the Soviet regime were the diplomats with the longest relations with them and the most realistic outlook, like we're going to talk about George Kennan in a little while, who's going to say, hey, we need to do containment. You can't cooperate with the Soviets. They are intent on just grabbing more and more. George Kennan, by the way, and this is the time. Let me just a little background on what's going on in America. Once we clue in to the Soviets trying to take over the world, this is a place where you actually have bipartisanship in America. You've got both Democrats and Republicans working together saying we need to resist the Soviets. Kennan, I'm pretty sure, was a Democrat. Um, Again, it's understandable the Soviets were concerned. They'd repeatedly been invaded, and we had actually got involved in the Russian Revolution. Um, but we could talk about that another time. I think it was to shore up the Eastern Front and to help our allies. We were involved in a war at the time. Um, but their actions were not consonant with such fears. If you're not sure you can trust your allies, aren't there better, more diplomatic ways to work on that than to take over half a continent? So again, I think that there are better things they could have done. Made alliances. Again, the Baltic states. Have the Baltic states ever invaded them? Right? Finland, was Finland really that big of a threat? Um, so I ask you, does this sound like moral equivalent? Well, I would say emphatically no. Finally, America wakes up to the fact the Soviet regime was intent on enforcing its will on as many countries as possible and was not to be trusted in diplomacy. And they certainly weren't the allies we'd hoped they'd be. So, next, we'll talk about how the Americans finally wake up. So, this is where we left off during the last lecture. We're talking about how throughout that lecture, the Soviet Union did not follow through with their commitments, and they both the motivations, the intentions and the actions of both sides showed that the Soviet Union was intent on spreading communism, America wanting to work with the Soviets, but finally it becomes apparent that we can't. And I just wanted to add one more thing about when the Soviet Union took over these areas. How did the people themselves feel about it? They didn't have democratic control. Just because you can't vote for your government doesn't mean you can't have a free life necessarily. But how do the people themselves view it? Everybody needs to check out a book called Iron Curtain by Anne Applebaum, and she does a really good job, I think, of showing what it was really like. I'm just going to give you a second to read this quote. You need to read the whole book. Um, but this quote I think gives an idea of what many behind what the Iron Curtain. Churchill will give a speech in America where he says an Iron Curtain has descended across Europe. On one side there's freedom, and on the other side there's not. And this is how people felt. I'll give you a second to read this. So obviously the Soviet Union, in America, was America perfect? Did we do everything right? No, but you know what? Our academics will talk about that. As a matter of fact, you're much more likely to get college professors saying bad things about America than positive things. Soviet Union was not going to allow that. They're not going to allow their historians to say bad things about what they've done. So always talked about as it was liberation. However, there are stories of people who thought the Soviets were going to be liberating them, but then they saw how horrible it actually was. Um, Even people who were fighting the Germans, as we saw with the Warsaw Uprising, the Soviets didn't help. But we see places where they're actually these people are attacked by the Soviet Union because they view them as an alternative source of power. And ultimately, often the talks we have are going to be just about that, about power, who's going to have it. And so many times the people would view this as the brutal beginning of a new occupation. One horrible instance of this, it mentions in this quote about arbitrary violence being just without cause, or they don't know why it's happening. Looting is, mass stealing, and of course the mass rape that followed. And we haven't heard much about that. It's more starting to come to the fore now. Um, Here's what one historian, how he describes it. And then thousands of women die as a result of this rape. It was so violent. Of course, we also are going to see some of these women after the fact raped by so many men, but ask the soldiers to kill them, and when they've seen their own children being raped. Um, and then some of the Russian soldiers would be almost hurt, like, well, we don't shoot women, that's the Germans, they do that. So no, they would rape them though. So and of course, lots of abortions and infanticide follow this. And how is Stalin taking it? Now, were did American soldiers rape? Yes, sure, but nowhere. And how about the British and the French? Were the rapes in there by their soldiers? Yes, but there's just no comparison in the numbers. Okay, so finally, the Americans wake up. Up to now, we've been trying to work with the Soviets, and now Truman is in, and he's not. And I talked about FDR being taken in by Stalin. FDR was not a stupid person, and again, I still rank him as a success, even though he was taken in by the Soviets, and he was in charge of the flaming failure of this foolish disaster called the New Deal. But he did win World War II, and that does count for something. Um, but then Truman takes over, and he's much more open-minded, or open-sighted. He can, see what's really going on, much more realistic. And some one historian I read has actually suggested maybe FDR, he's about to die, and maybe his failing health was also impacting his mental acuity, his ability to think things through. But then Truman, when he takes over, um, he finally realizes what's going on, and Americans wake up. And here's Truman. He takes over, and here's Molotov. Uh, Remember that pact the Nazis made with the Soviets made with the Nazis, and actually it's called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And this is a guy in charge of foreign policy who, even after Stalin is dead, ended up defending Stalin. And here's this guy who had signed who knows how many thousands of death warrants. And finally, Truman says, you need to follow through with your agreements. And Ribbentrop says, I have never been talked to like that in my life. And Truman, good no nonsense Midwesterners, well, carry out your agreements and you won't get talked to like that. So, Soviet aggression finally convinced Americans to once again reluctantly take a tougher stance. And why do I say once again reluctantly? Again reluctant? Remember, was America eager to get into World War II? No, we almost waited too long. And maybe it's time for us to reawaken that idea that America was built on the idea that we don't get into other people's business. We want to trade with everybody. We don't want a big standing military that gets into other people's wars. And so we are not eager to get into conflict with the Soviets. But finally, we take a tougher stance, but it's still a restrained stance. And that will be embedded in the doctrine of containment. To not invade the Soviets, but to prevent them from taking over the world. We'll talk more about what containment, the particulars of our, in a little while. And many Americans are now convinced we won't let the events that led to World War II repeat themselves. So a lot of Americans are now said, you know what, we almost waited too long to get into World War II, and Hitler could have taken over the world. We can't let that happen again. If Stalin takes over Europe, and he and his allies take over Asia, they might become unstoppable. We can't let this happen. So we're going to get involved now. This will be embodied in the Truman Doctrine. So we're going to see as we move on. When we talk about foreign policies, we're going to talk about whoever's the president who came up with that policy. We'll say his name and doctrine. We'll have a Carter Doctrine. We'll have a Reagan Doctrine. So here's the Truman Doctrine, and here's Truman describing it to Congress as he's asking them to follow through. So, a little background on it. The British, remember, they'd had an empire, but their empire, we now know, was actually costing them money. They're actually better off without an empire. It actually takes more to keep an empire than you get out of it. And they're so war weary, spent so much on World War II, and they not too long before that, World War One, and they can't keep the empire anymore. And they now ask America to pick up the baton, to take on those international responsibilities. Winston Churchill was voted out of office during the Potsdam meeting, actually, and he was replaced by the Labour Party Prime Minister Clement Attlee. And the British are tired of maintaining this world-spanning imperial role, and they're pulling back. So Churchill asked Truman if America could take over Britain's role as a bulwark against aggression, stopping the communist expansion. And it's first going to come to the fore where Britain had been involved in Greece and Turkey. If you see my boxed in area in the south of Europe, the pronouncement of the Truman Doctrine is going to be motivated by problems in Greece and Turkey. The British had been giving aid to these countries to help them resist coups from within. Remember I said the Soviet Union not only keeps control wherever they've invaded, but they also want to expand power by having coups. Remember, coup is when a small group takes over a country it's not representative of the people at large. Think about it. How did the Bolsheviks take over the Soviet Union in the first place? With coups. They just had armed groups go over and take over the legislatures. And they're going to try to do that in Greece and Turkey, have armed groups take over. And the people in those countries who don't want communism, they're not organized, they don't have the funds, and so to resist. So if you've got financial and military assistance flowing in to a small group, but the majority doesn't get any assistance from anybody else, that minority could take over. The British, however, had run out of funds, so President Truman announced the Truman Doctrine. And I give you again that quote that he gave to Congress pretty much embodies it. In short, America was now taking an open-ended commitment, both military and economic, to preserve democracy in the world. We are not going to turn to isolationism as we had after World War I. And so we're going to send aid to Turkey and Greece so they're not taken over by communism. And throughout the rest of the Cold War, America is now saying that it'll help any free country defend against a communist overthrow to stay free or prevent invasion. That's pretty much what the Truman Doctrine is about. Next major embodiment of America becoming more aware and resisting the Soviet Union would be the Marshall Plan. So, named after the Secretary of State, George Marshall, who had been the top general in charge of our military during World War II. So you see my picture at the top. That's in the ruins, people having a market. Europe has been devastated by all these years of war, and their economy's in a shambles. George Marshall suggests that we give aid to these countries that are trying to rebuild. $13 billion in economic aid is sent to help rebuild the European economies. Some would call this the most successful scheme of its kind in history, particularly effective in rebuilding the economies of Germany, France, and Italy. And think about it. When before had any other nation given so much to other countries, especially its vanquished enemies, to help them rebuild? Yeah, I know America's imperialists, right? Well, here, Germany had attacked us, had declared war on us, was trying to take over the world. We conquer Germany, and then we give them lots of money to help them rebuild. And by the way, what a lot of people don't know, we also offered the money to anybody in Europe, the Soviet Union too, and the Soviet Union's puppet states, its satellites. But the Soviet Union, remember, these countries aren't free. Those countries wanted it, but the Soviet Union, on their behalf, said no. Now, so you see here a map of which countries got how much of the aid. A lot of this aid, it kind of irks me that Sweden got all this aid. I mean, 40% of the iron ore that went to the Nazis came from Sweden. People talk about how wonderful Swedish socialism is today. Yeah, what makes their economy run is not socialism. It's free market. In many ways, they're more free market than us. And another reason their economy might be somewhat well off is because they didn't fight in World War One or Two, which takes a huge toll on a country. Matter of fact, they're making money during World War Two. Again, 40% of the iron ore the Nazis used, they got from Sweden. So, but anyway, we're not wanting to refight World War II. We're looking to the future, and we want to help Europe rebuild. Why? Well, two main reasons. One you have in the notes, but make sure you get all this in case you don't have it in the notes. You write it down. The first part you have in your notes: poverty makes societies susceptible to communism. If you're poor and somebody comes up to you and says, "Hey, you're poor because that guy's rich. Put me in power. We'll take from the rich and give to the poor," and that's being poverty makes people rife to appeals to communism. Think about it. Why has America never been that successful breeding ground for communism? We talked about this when we talked about unions, right? Why did America not have the radical unions Europe did? America had unions, but our unions were like, hey, we don't want to get rid of capitalism. We just want to make sure we get our fair share of it. No problem with that. So America hasn't been a strong breeding ground for communism because America's workers have been getting better and better and better off. And so if we can help these economies recover quickly, because the Soviets are intent on taking these places over, and still today, you've got communist countries have, European countries have communist parties, very powerful communist parties in Italy and France. Um, and so if they stay poor, our fear was the Soviets might not have to invade. They might vote for communism, and it might make it easier to bring the Soviets in as well. So if we can help them rebuild, they won't be to get their economy going. Communism won't be so appealing. Also, this you don't have the notes, so make sure you get it down. If we can help these countries rebuild, they can build up militaries that can help us resist the Soviet Union. Okay, the key to a strong military is a strong economy. Remember, America's major contribution to World War II was our powerful economy could produce so much stuff. So if we can get Germany to rebuild, Germany can make its own tanks and rifles and aircraft and use that, add that to our army to resist the Soviet Union. That's the ideas behind the Marshall Plan. Um, so you see the result down the bottom right. You see just an example: countries rebuilding with help from the Marshall Plan. And in the bottom left, you see what the idea embodied in this plan is. Um, the purpose would be the revival of a working economy to permit the emergence of political and social conditions where free institutions can exist. If people are destitute, they will listen to calls for radicalism that will destroy everything that could provide freedom. So we'll just leave it at that. Let me just say, do I think the Marshall Plan really was the cause of Europe recovering? There's been some studies now that really cast doubt on that. I would argue what Europe really needed was freedom. Once they no longer have the fascism, the Nazis running things, and some would argue Japan and Germany both notice their economies recover pretty quickly. It's a horrible thing they went through World War II, but it was actually good for them that they got rid of those uh, totalitarian governments and brought in some free markets and their economy recovers. Really what Europe needed was freedom because they've got a lot of smart, hardworking people. Once they get the government off their backs, they could really make their economies recover. So we'll go ahead and go with it. Marshall Plan, at least it shows we're trying to help. I think they would have recovered just with freedom in itself, but Marshall Plan is still an example of America not trying to take over the world, but help others stay free in line with the ideas of the Truman Doctrine. Then America will come up with the name for our whole plan. The strategy comes together that codifies it, kind of makes more formal our ideas about what are we doing in trying to stop the Soviets. Do we want to let them take over the world? No. Do we want to invade them? No. Well, is there some other approach we can have? We finally come up with this idea of containment. And so I got a picture here of the guy who came up with it, a guy who'd had many years of experience with the Soviets, and George Kennan. He was convinced the only thing, after dealing with them so long, the only thing they respected was strength. If you try to work with them, accommodate, well, look, we'll give you this, now will you work with us? like Hitler. Remember when you try to give Hitler stuff that he said, "Well, thank you. You're being understanding. I'll work with you." No, he said, "You're weak. I'll grab more." That's how the communists saw it. They saw accommodation as a sign of weakness in the opponent, a weakness that they would exploit. So what did Kennan call for? As I say here, patient. It's not going to happen overnight. Communism isn't going to collapse overnight. But we got to be firm and vigilant. Key word here, containment. The communists have, and he wouldn't say it's just even communists, he said this goes back to totalitarianism in Russian past. They have but the Soviet Union has these expansionist tendencies. They're going to tend, and we've got to keep them from expanding with the adroit and vigilant application of counterforce. So notice we're not invading, but wherever they have force, we will have counterforce at constantly shifting points. So, and notice he says adroit. Adroit means agile, right? We're not just coming in here with a sledgehammer and just hitting everything that moves. And we're not going to necessarily even fight them everywhere. Okay? We're going to resist where it's important to the long-term strategy, and not everything is important. Okay? As a matter of fact, I actually got to meet George Kennan. And when I was in college, he came and talked to a political science class my roommate was in, and I wasn't in there, but I said, "Wow, George Kennan." So I sat in, and at the end, they opened up for questions, and I said, "Did you think Vietnam should have fell under containment?" And he said, "No, it just wasn't that important." So he would say, East Germany or West Germany, yeah, the Soviets tried to invade, we got to stop them. Because if they get West Germany, that's a lot of industrial power. They get really powerful. They could take over more. Vietnam, though, he said, it's just not important enough. The people there are important. They're valuable. We care about their freedom, but you got to look at long-term strategy that will lead to victory. And he said we can't fight everywhere. So that's what he means by adroit. So summing it up, in other words, the Soviets, they've proven their intent on expanding. So wherever they want to expand, and it's a location important to the rest of the free world, will apply counter pressure. Eventually, they'll collapse from within because they don't have a stable means of passing on the reins of government. Remember we talked about how important that is, that we have peaceful transfer of power going all the way back to what's the most important thing George Washington and John Adams did? They went home. You lose the election, you go home, the other guy comes in. Soviets don't have that tradition. So one thing that could cause them to collapse is when a leader dies and the next guy takes over. Also, more importantly, they have a weak economic system. At least later leaders, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, are going to see it this way. This is actually how it's going to turn out. Their economy doesn't work. It collapsed from within. And Kennan first put together, pronounced the concept of containment in a document called the Long Telegram, what they call the X article. Long because he was asked for a response, and usually telegrams were short, but he's like, no, this is going to take some explaining. So he wrote the Long Telegram that put together the idea of containment. So the next paragraph of the notes. Did it work? Yes. Through the Marshall Plan and NATO that we'll talk about, and the Berlin Airlift that we'll talk about. Other examples, some would say the Korean War. I'm not sure whether Kennan would agree with that, but some would say the Korean War. We contained Soviet expansion until it collapsed of its own economic weaknesses, and we avoided a catastrophic war in doing so. I think this was a great example of really applying history. History doesn't repeat itself. So you can't just say, well, last war this happened, so let's respond to that. On the one hand, we don't want to get into an unnecessary war. We've learned that. On the other hand, you let an evil dictator take over more and more, he gets more and more powerful. So we don't let Stalin take over the world, but we don't kick off a war with him. What's the next? So you see my little brackets here around the Soviet Union and arrows showing some key points we're going to resist to keep them from expanding and getting more powerful. Okay. Next major step that America is going to take is we're going to leave permanent forces in Europe. We were pulling out, but then we saw the Soviet Union wasn't doing it. They're trying to grab more. And so we're going to leave forces permanently in Europe. The thinking being, well, remember what happened in Pearl Harbor, right? The Japanese killed a couple thousand Americans, 3,000 Americans. That's horrible, but still, that's 2 or 3,000. How many did we lose throughout all of World War II? Over 200,000, right? You kill Americans, Americans will demand revenge. Whether that's how it ought to be or not, that's how it is. We're a democracy. Democracies want revenge. So by leaving American troops there, that's going to act as a deterrent to the communists from invading. Shows that we really mean it. If they invade, they're going to kill Americans, and we're going to have Americans who can fight there and stop them and slow them down, hopefully. But also, we'll send more. And so that's our way of showing the Soviets we really mean it. But it's not going to be Americans by themselves. It's going to be Americans with other free people. So the organization we're going to create is called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So we reversed our plans to withdraw, and we coordinate the defenses of free Europe with others who want to stay free. So what we're going to say in NATO is each country considers the attack on any of these nations an attack on all of us, including America, and we'll bring our nukes with us. So, Soviet Union, you invade West Germany, Americans are already there, you're going to have to kill Americans. And actually, we even have Americans. We got the Berlin Brigade. I remember meeting some guys from the Berlin Brigade, and they called themselves a tripwire, right? They didn't think they could stop the Russians, but the Russians kill American soldiers. They know that means war. That's why Berlin stayed free. If we didn't have those Americans there, I have no doubt the Soviets would have rolled the tanks in just like they did other places. So notice we're not invading, but we're staying where we are. And so these countries, we call it NATO because it's not only Northern Europe, but also the other parts of the Atlantic, Canada, and America. Each of us say, you attack any one of us, it's the same as attacking all of us, and we'll all fight. We're not going to wait too late as we had before World War II. If you think about it, when the Nazis invaded Czechoslovakia, if all of Europe had acted right then, right? Think about it. If Sweden, if Norway, Switzerland, who stayed out of it the whole time, don't even get me started on Switzerland. So Switzerland, who would actually shoot down our airplanes when we actually strayed over Switzerland, they'd shoot them down. And then we had Americans who become POWs in Switzerland. And one guy, we got a story of him getting raped while he's in prison, and the Swiss guards laughed at it, thought it was funny. But everything Switzerland's so wonderful. So Switzerland, Sweden stay out the whole time. But if Switzerland and Sweden and Norway, France, if France had invaded while Germany's going east and was distracted, France just stood there. They called it the phony war. If Russia hadn't split up Poland, right, if they'd worked together, they could have stopped Germany even that late. So now we're not going to wait too late. We're going to work together to remember what Victor Davis Hanson said about World War II. We didn't have to have World War II. You could know ahead that Germany could not win this war. But because the opponents of Germany didn't make it clear that we would act with the force we've got, that encouraged the Nazis to give it a shot. Here we're saying ahead of time, no, we will all stand together and we will stop the Soviets from taking over more. So one thing you need to be able to do, possibly short answer question, you need to be able to explain why would NATO work whereas the League of Nations failed? And we talked about this after World War I. Remember World War I? After that, we had the League of Nations. Here's why. NATO worked on mutual self-interest, not abstract ideals. NATO worked on mutual self-interest, not abstract ideals. So I remind you, why do countries go to war? They go to war because they think they have more to gain than to lose. So countries will go to war. So if I think my country is going to be conquered and enslaved, and mass rape would follow, like we saw happen when the Soviets invaded Germany, would we be willing to send our 18-year-olds into harm's way? Yeah, we're not going to like it, but we do it if it's in our interest. And what do I mean by self-interest? By self-interest, I mean it's what's in it for me, well, my country. What do I mean by mutual self-interest? You know, between World War I and World War II, we had all these treaties signed. None of them meant anything. We actually outlawed war. Well, why didn't that take effect? Why didn't it prevent Japan and Germany from invading countries if we'd outlawed war? Because they just ignored it. Okay, it's not in the interest of one country to worry about another country getting invaded if it has no impact on them. But we're showing that if Russia invades West Germany, it does matter to us because we're afraid if Russia gets more powerful, they might become unstoppable. And Britain is worried about the same thing. So is Canada. So is Norway. So all of us are concerned if the Soviet Union attacks any country, it'll get more powerful and that'll hurt each one of us. So it's a self-interest, but it's an interest we all share. That's why you can't just make alliances with the whole world because the countries of the world have different interests. But you can make an alliance and know that your allies will follow through if you share the same interest. If you want to protect freedom and prevent the Russians from taking over the world. Okay, the League of Nations was different. It was based on abstract ideals like world peace. And it's just highly unlikely that countries are going to send their 18-year-olds to die for something as abstract as world peace. To send your son to die in a country we've never even heard of for something called world peace. And the Soviet Union knew that. Compare Japan and the League of Nations with the Soviet Union and NATO. When Japan invaded China, the League of Nations wrote up reports saying, Japan, this is horrible. Did Japan care? No, because they knew Europe was not going to do a thing about their invading China because it wasn't directly impacting their interests. On the other hand, did the Soviets think we would do anything if they invaded Germany or Berlin? Yes, they did. We know there were plans the Soviet Unions had to invade West Germany. Why didn't they? Because they took it seriously. The key thing is in deterrence and preventing a war is, does your enemy take you seriously? Do they believe you when you say you will fight? They did. Because it makes sense. Because they knew that our interests we really shared with the British and the Canadians and the Norwegians and the West Germans. They knew we all really had the same interest. We were being realistic and pragmatic, not idealistic. And by the way, how do we back it up? How do we add to convince the Russians we really believed it? Again, we left permanent troops there. So it's not just, so NATO, two parts. It's our alliance with these other countries, we're working together, but it's also our putting troops there permanently. Now, if we bring this up to the current times, it does bring up the question of why do we still have troops there? You ever wonder why? That's kind of weird. Why does America have forts in Germany? Why do we have soldiers who live there for years? Good question, right? We were there first because of the Cold War. It made sense during the Cold War. Now, why are we there? Yeah, yeah, I wonder that too, right? So, yeah, it does deter Russia from invading, but you know what? Can't Germany protect themselves? They're a big, powerful country. They're one of the most advanced countries in the history of the world. They've got a lot of people. Couldn't they defend themselves? If France and Germany worked together, couldn't they create an alliance that could make sure Russia never invaded? I don't see why not. Now, I don't know if you've heard about this, but we've had many, not just President Trump before him, President Obama was also telling the Europeans, you need to spend more on defense. Okay, and President Trump sent Mad Dog Mattis when he was the Secretary of Defense over to Europe to say, hey, it's about time that you cared as much about defending your own children as we do and spend more on your own defense. Okay, not too long ago, it was a couple years ago, I guess Belgium, I think it was Belgium, got rid of the last of their tanks. They don't have tanks. Pretty sure it was Belgium. Why do they do that? Because they think America will come. And so they don't have to spend the money. They get to let us spend the money and then say how horrible and imperialistic America is. Okay, so why are we still there? If we pulled out, wouldn't that give them a warning and then they got to rebuild their own military? It's about time. Some would argue it's about time Europeans grow up and move out of the parents' basement and defend themselves. Don't have to agree with that. I'm, just thinking things through. Maybe it would make things a lot more volatile and possibly violent if we moved out. But it's helpful to know how we got in this position in the first place. We got all these troops there at a time when it really looked like with the communists were going to take over the world. Maybe we should be asking ourselves, are we still in that situation? It is nice to have these alliances, but remember, is that what the founders wanted? Remember George Washington warning us about untangling alliances, that we might get dragged into wars that we really got no business in. So, not saying necessarily we should move out, but maybe it's time to be aware of where NATO came from and wonder if we still need to be there. Okay, next major action America will take when we wake up to resist Soviet expansion and contain them. Next great example of where containment gets challenged and we put it into play and it actually really works will be Berlin. The Berlin blockade, which will be followed by the Berlin airlift. So, as you recall, Berlin is inside of the Soviet controlled part of Germany. So, it's in East Germany. And remember, Berlin, you see in this map a zoomed in portion where we'd also split up Berlin into occupation zones. And then when America, Britain, and France say, okay, it's time for these guys to take over their own country, and we decide to pull out, the Soviets don't, then we've got Berlin split up, Western Free Berlin, Eastern Communist Berlin. So what sparked this crisis? So you see the line I drew there. I'm not exactly sure where the road was, but a road going from the U.S. zone to Berlin. Obviously, a city can't raise enough food and get enough coal and all the things they need to survive. The Soviet Union did not like West Berlin being here. It was a huge embarrassment. Again, if don't take my word for it. Maybe I'm just saying America's great because I'm an American and I'm a jingoist. And if I were Russian, I'd say something different. Well, let's look at the people themselves. If you really want to know, don't go by what they say. Go by what they do. They were fleeing communism and rushing into Berlin. It was a huge embarrassment because they said, we're freeing the world. Communism is wonderful. Capitalism is horrible and oppressive. If it's so oppressive, why are people fleeing into it? So they wanted to get rid of this huge embarrassment. And so the Soviet Union shut off, put a blockade, shut off the roads going into Berlin from West Germany, hoping to starve them out. And they did this during the winter, so they weren't going to get cold and they were going to freeze. That's what sparked this crisis. They were hoping that West Berlin would say, okay, we need food and coal, so we'll go ahead and let you take over, but please don't starve us. How did America respond? This is the first great big test of containment. Do nothing, the communists take over and show, hey, the Americans won't rescue you. Go ahead and take our side. We're the strong horse in this race. And set a precedent that we'll do nothing and they'll take over more. On the other hand, if we invade, we start a war. We don't have a war with the Soviet Union right now. Remember, they got a lot more divisions than us. This could turn really nasty. We don't want an unnecessary war. But what would containment call for? Prevent them from taking over. And remember the Truman Doctrine. Help whoever says they want to be free. Help them stay free. So how did we respond? Well, we responded to the Berlin blockade with the Berlin airlift. Oops, sorry about my road, got a little mixed up in the next slide. But you see what happened. This is a picture of aircraft coming in, bringing in food and coal. And, just one example, milk wasn't the main thing, but tons and tons and tons of wheat and coal and all the things a city needs to survive. And we were able to bring enough resources in, this is how we responded, that we enabled them to survive and not collapse to the Soviet Union. So this monument is to the people who died in the airlift. There were accidents. Most of them were not flying accidents, but one example at least of a flying accident in really bad weather where there was a wreck. So we showed that we were willing to help free people stay free. So what did we accomplish? Well, first of all, as I've said, we showed that we would stand up for the people who want to stay free. And we've got this powerful military, powerful economy, and we would use that to help these people stay free. If you want freedom, You can look to America. We will help you stay free. And that was going to discourage the Soviets from taking over. Okay, that'll help people have the will to resist. And also, we flexed our muscles because look at all these airplanes, and hopefully that we're giving the idea that they could bring equipment and bombs too. And I actually believe they were not capable of bombing, but hopefully not everybody would figure that out. And so we flexed our muscles to show, hey, we're still a powerful military. You can't invade people who are our allies. So, summary of all these steps. In effect, we saved Europe again. So, continuing the theme of the idea of Americans finally waking up, we're going to look at it, what's going on the home front of the Cold War. And usually, what you'll hear this called is the Red Scare. Now, I give a definition for that in your notes. Concern American security was being threatened from within by communist spies and traitors. But the connotations that usually go with this are anti-communist people being irrational. They've got these irrational, unjustified fears, and that this irrational fear is leading unreasonable anti-communists to attack innocent people. And so that's why we call it the Red Scare. What are you afraid of? It's not that big a deal. It's just a small group of people who are anti-communist, just a small group that are communist and in America, and your irrational fear is leading you to attack a lot of innocent people, and it's something. This whole era is something we should regret. Um, so I actually think, however, that there really was something to be scared of. This concern, at least concern, was justified. I mean, think about what we've seen. Um, the Soviets didn't have control only in countries where they had pushed out the Nazis, but they had also backed armed coups in several countries. And remember, how did the Bolsheviks take over in Russia in the first place? Bolsheviks were not the majority. They took over by a small minority using armed force to seize power. And that was a part of their plan. They'd done in other countries. And there had in America been bombings. There had been, we're later going to find that the Communist Party was receiving money from the Soviet Union. And it turns out actually Communist Party members actually had penetrated the government in significant, if not overwhelming numbers. And don't forget, so who are these people that we're dealing with? These people are people who are willing to kill, not all of them, but I mean, part of the leaders of the communists who took over were willing to kill millions to accomplish their goals. And don't forget, how did the Soviet Union get a nuclear bomb so quickly after us? They stole our nuclear secrets. How do you think they got that? They had spies. They had here are the Rosenbergs who were found guilty of handing over our nuclear secrets to the Soviets at the time. They were cause célèbre. Many in the media said this is horrible. These innocent people are being attacked. And one of the things we're going to find out here is later, once the Iron Curtain fell, communism fell, and we've got information that was made free, we found out many of the people we thought were spies actually were. And even before that, we were able to prove that many of these people actually were spies. And again, once your country falls to this, don't forget what had happened in the countries that the communists had taken over in many places. Stalin killed maybe 20 million. The Chinese Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution killed tens of millions. Later, Pol Pot in Cambodia killed 1 out of 8 million people. 1 out of 8 in his country killed. So to say, as many in the media and academia tend to insinuate today, that people fearful of communists are naive and overreaching, I would argue is yourself to be naive and blind yourself to the facts. like we saw FDR seeing Churchill as naive, but it turns out FDR was actually the one naive who was falling for Stalin and letting Stalin manipulate him. There actually were spies in America. That's how the Soviets developed nuclear weapons so quickly. Again, and a work would come out later, what we now know about how many of these people actually were spies. Now, we're going to see there are people who twist this to their political agenda and overblow it, but that doesn't mean everybody who was afraid of anti-communism was blowing things out of proportion. Um, so here's one example. Bill Ayers, who in the 1960s will co-found the Weather Underground, who will uh, have bombings in America, and their opposition is to the Vietnam War, but that's not all. They want to bring in communism. He will become a professor of education at the University of Illinois. Um, so he is training teachers how to teach. Remember, we talked about the 1920s, the trickle down. You've got intellectuals who influence the teachers, and then they pass that on to the students. It doesn't happen in every school, but this is the goal of many communists. And remember, one of the most, if not the most used AP U.S. history textbook is Howard Zinn's U.S. history textbook that is communist. It is Marxist through and through. So the Weather Underground, right? What was their goal? Their goal was to have a revolution, and then the fear was there'd be a counter-revolution, and they feared this revolution, and they thought the best way of guarding against it was establishing, this has been in the news recently, I don't know if you heard about it, re-education camps, okay, where they would have to re-educate people to teach them to not be brainwashed by capitalism anymore and to embrace communism. Remember, that had happened in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, if you opposed communism, you could be sent to an insane asylum because only the insane could oppose communism. Vietnam, we're going to find, would have these re-education camps, and many people would die. So this, I get this from a book where this book is quoting somebody who had worked with the underground, the Weather Underground, and then he says, well, what about the people that you can't re-educate? And they're going to have to go. They said, look at this quote. They estimated we'd have to eliminate 25 million people in these re-education centers. Kill them, in other words. And I take that seriously because it did happen in other countries. Millions of people who opposed communism or were even seen as possibly a threat were killed. So minorities can take over countries, and once they seize the means of power, they can wreak horrible destruction. Remember, the Nazis were not a majority. They're a big minority, but still they're a minority. But once you seize the means of the power in your society, you can wreak horrible destruction. By then, it's too late. So I think we did have something to be afraid of. Again, we're going to find out that some people would overblow it and use it for political means, but that doesn't mean everybody who opposed communism was being irrational. Remember Truman, a Democrat. There were plenty of, this is not a Republican Democrat thing. There were plenty of Democrats who, and plenty of union members, the people you usually think of on the left, who feared communism and said, we got to stop this. And Truman would get rid of a lot of communists in the government. So, just another example of what can happen when these radicals do take over and win. Of course, the Great Leap Forward in China. So, what you see bottom left is, you know, capitalism works because it lets the free market decide who's going to produce what, and it leads to unparalleled prosperity. Remember, that's why Deirdre McCloskey says that she loves capitalism, is it's for the poor because it produces wealth like we've never seen before. And that's why we are seeing poverty around the world disappear like has never happened before, because places like China and India have introduced at least some free market, some trade, free trade. But when you have the government decide who's going to produce what, the production will be only good as the decisions of the people in charge, but they don't have the information given by the free market. and they will use violence also to enforce their will. So you've got people who should be farming, forced to go make steel. These are people in their backyards, on their own property, having these small steel furnaces, which is highly inefficient, uh, and it leads to famine. See on the right side a graph of global deaths from 1950 to 2017. You see this spike, and that was caused by the Great Leap Forward. Now, the bottom, you're like, why does he have a bird there? There's one phase where, again, if you're either going to have a free market or you're going to have people calling the shots. So, some supposedly philosopher king, some wise person calling the shots, and telling people what to do, or you can have some mix of it. Okay, America, we tend to have a mix. But the more you put one person in charge, uh, the more you're going to have people following his orders as opposed to the dictates of the market. And so when you're having this famine, Mao decides he needs a scapegoat. So one of the scapegoats he decides that we had was um, the sparrow. And so they have people going around China attacking sparrows, preventing them from landing in trees to exhaust them, and destroying sparrows. And so the people who, instead of producing with a free market, we told them, they're out there killing sparrows. And guess what then happens? Then the sparrows that had been killing bugs are now gone, and now the bugs eat the crops. So that's always that's the cycle we see when communism takes over. Production collapses, and then you got to find some scapegoat to blame. Okay, so just an example of what can happen when communists do take over a country. I think we had a lot to fear of. And as I said, there were reasonable, rational prosecutions of communists. So Alger Hiss was a communist spy, and he had been in the FDR administration. And a guy who had been a communist, Whittaker Chambers, outed him. And of course, the media took the side of Alger Hiss and attacked Chambers. Richard Nixon, at the time, was in Congress, and he prosecuted Hiss. And eventually, it became clear that Hiss was actually guilty. And this is even before the secrets from the Soviet Union were released. So this is an example of somebody who actually was a rational, reasonable persecutor or prosecutor of communists, real communists. And this is before the problems we're going to see later that'll pop up with Richard Nixon. But again, this is not a Republican thing. Actually, JFK's dad met Nixon and said, keep it up, good job. And JFK himself was also anti-communist. However, many people today would say, even people who oppose communism would say, the greatest asset of the communists was Senator McCarthy. I'm going to give you the received wisdom about McCarthy. I still need to do some more reading. Some people are pushing back against this, but then other people said, no, this guy's crazy. So there are some people who argue McCarthy may have been justified. Others, still the majority tends to say he was using the fear of communists to advance himself politically. So by the time McCarthy made a big deal about communists, most of the communists in public service has already been removed by people like, remember Truman, Democrat, had attacked, sought out communists in the government to get rid of them, and Nixon. But McCarthy said he had a list of 205 names of members of the State Department who were part of a communist spy ring. But there was actually no list of names. He just made it up. He was never a serious investigator of subversion like Nixon, but he got a lot of publicity from the ruckus he made. The only consequence of his activities was to cause trouble for a lot of innocent people and discredit the activities of those generally concerned to make America safe. How did he fall? Eventually, he overreached himself when he accused the Army of harboring communists, and then the Senate investigations of the Army were televised, allowing the whole country to see themselves McCarthy's bullying and irrational tactics. And it didn't help his cause when it emerged that McCarthy's chief aide had put pressure on the Army to secure favors for his boyfriend. So an aide of his had a boyfriend in the Army who he had tried to get favors for, and that really turned people against the McCarthy agenda. Unfortunately, the legacy of McCarthy would be that intellectuals concluded that McCarthyism, by which today many incorrectly bunch together all anti-communist forces of the 1950s, was just a projection onto society of the groundless fear of pseudo-conservatives. But uh, even if McCarthy was being irrational and unsubstantiated in his claims, there were many people who were substantiated, and again, whose claims were substantiated. And again, it wasn't a Republican thing, it was bipartisan fear that the communists were posing a threat to our future. Um, but this idea that it was just this irrational projection of groundless fears, that explanation of, again, going along with that idea of the Red Scare, you're irrationally scared, that's the explanation that is often unquestionably offered to so many high school and college students and unwary TV viewers. And it's become the official liberal explanation anytime there's conservative criticism. Anyone questions anything you do, just label them McCarthyites, and then their reputation is smudged, so you don't even have to defend yourself, because we all know about the terrible McCarthyism of the 1950s. Again, I've read some people who are pushing back and said McCarthy was justified in what he was doing and he wasn't irrational. But then I've read other people who said these people are being silly. So I'm just going to have to do some more research, and we'll just go for the test. And what I need you to know, we'll go with the traditional understanding of McCarthy is that he was irrational and using anti-communism for for political gain. Okay. Now, one aspect of the Cold War that would make it so much different. Oh, I'm sorry. Here are some second thoughts. There we go. Some second before I move on to what I was about to move to nuclear weapons. Here are some second thoughts on McCarthy, and I felt comfortable going with this because it's in what you'd usually view as a liberal source, Washington Post. Um, Once the vaults from the National Security Agency, the NSA, were releasing more information that we had, um, it appears that the Roosevelt and actually the Truman administration were both rife with communist spies and political operatives who directly or indirectly reported to the Soviet government. So the thing they love to call this is a witch hunt. Um, and of course, so many high school students are forced to read The Crucible by Miller, who was a communist. And he would, at the time, say, "Oh, I'm not a communist." Later, when it's safe and cool to be a communist, and everybody in college is wearing their Che Guevara shirts, he would say, "Oh, yeah, I was a communist." At the time, "Oh, no, I'm not a communist." And it's so irrational. People have these irrational feelings. You've got to go find some witch to justify your being on a hunt. And same thing with communism. You got to find some communist to attack, even if there isn't one. So you got to call innocent people communist. But it actually wasn't a witch hunt. There actually were. Um, a dangerous number of people with a lot of dangerous information that were threatening the American government handing over secrets to communist governments. So, like I mentioned, I showed you a picture. Ethel and Julius Rosenberg actually were guilty. Alger Hiss was guilty, and there were others who now we know were guilty, or at least supporting our enemies. Okay, now, one aspect of the Cold War that's going to make it the strategic situation so different is going to be nuclear weapons that ended World War II. Um, so, as I already mentioned, if you're following along in the notes, Roman number 3A, the Soviets get their atom bomb not long after us, 1949, and again because they stole the secrets via spies. Then America has to one up them, and we explode our first hydrogen bomb. Then the big race, moving on to B, is there's a rapid escalation in not only the explosive power of the bombs, but also in the development of delivery systems. So we get bombers and intercontinental ballistic missiles, so they can go from one continent to another, and they go faster than the speed of sound. And so we would also have nuclear submarines that would be so constantly out there in the ocean somewhere, so that there would be the Soviets never knew. If they took out some of our missiles, we'd have these planes. They took out the planes, we'd have the missiles and the submarines. To constantly have the threat to the Soviets that there would be we could retaliate if they attacked us, or if they invaded Europe and we were overwhelmed. Um, so there would be even fears that it would become an electoral issue. JFK, remember, I said he was an anti-communist. One of the things he did to attack Nixon was he talked about the Eisenhower-Nixon administration allowed a missile gap to develop. The Soviets were getting ahead of us in their missiles, and they had bigger, more powerful missiles. What Nixon couldn't say with some of the technology is actually there wasn't a huge missile gap because we had improved miniaturization, and so we're not actually behind the Soviets. But this would be a very important issue, both Republicans and Democrats, and it would become an electoral issue as well. Now, moving on to C, why were they so attractive to American leaders? Because they were actually cheap, which sounds weird because it's going to be very expensive to build a nuclear bomb. However, think about it. America, we have to pay our soldiers. And with a high standard of living in America, much higher than the standard of living in the Soviet Union, it's going to be much more expensive to keep a large conventional army. Conventional means just soldiers with guns and tanks. So it's going to be much easier for the Soviets to do that. Plus, we have a democracy, like we talked about in a previous lecture. So you can't just force the troops to stay in the military all the time. They want to be free. Well, the Soviet Union could force people to be in the military, and again, they're so poor, it's not that much worse of a standard of living. So the phrase would come: "We get more bang for the buck with nuclear weapons." However, it would prove unwieldy. This idea, some people say, oh, war is over. We don't need a military anymore because we could just have nukes. But then it becomes apparent that politically speaking, you can't just use nukes anytime you want. Some people would talk about using nukes in Korea, but it just was not feasible. It was acceptable to American public to use nuclear weapons against Japan, whom we had viewed as an existential threat, but to use it in Korea, where it is not our very existence at stake, would not be supported. And so it turns out we're going to need also conventional military, because if all we have is nukes, the Soviets could get in, attack our allies in places where it wouldn't be important enough, American people would think, to use nuclear weapons, and so the Soviets could just take more and more land away. So it became apparent that we were going to still need conventional forces. So number two, something you got to keep in mind: nuclear weapons underlay America's deterrence policy throughout the Cold War. We were going to rely on nukes as a huge part of that's why even though we had a smaller military, we could back it up with nukes, and we would deter the Soviets from invading or using their nukes by having ours. And this would lead to new strategies, including the idea of MAD. And make sure you get this down. I don't have in the notes. Make sure you understand this. MAD stands for Mutually Assured Destruction, where both sides know we cannot start a nuclear war because you can't win a nuclear war. Both sides know we would get destroyed if we started this. But you have to have enough nukes to make sure the other guys know, hey, you can't just take out some of our missiles with the first strike and then we only get a couple off and then you'll still have enough people surviving. We got to know there's overkill. There's enough that we would wipe out your whole civilization. And both sides know that. And that actually keeps the peace. That is part of why it's a Cold War. America never and Russia never go directly. This is going to be something, make sure you understand this. This is why, well, actually, I'll get to that in a second. I'll talk about how it's going to impact our strategic thinking when I get down to E, if you're following along on the notes. So make sure you understand mutually assured destruction. MAD means both sides know if there's nuclear exchange, they'd both be destroyed, and that actually ends up keeping the peace. However, D, there were many influential Americans who opposed dependence on nuclear weapons. And I'll give an example: Reinhold Niebuhr, a Christian theologian who actually has written some really good stuff you ought to check out. Him talking about believing in Christianity in a pluralist society. A really good book. Um, but he says we say we're doing this to save civilization. Right, that's what we did. The Nazis were uncivilized. We're trying to save civilization. We're doing the same. The communists look at the horrible things the Soviets have done. We want to be. We're saving civilization. But he says nuclear holocaust, which is the complete destruction of entire civilizations, of the entire society of your enemy, that is uncivilized. Remember, we talked about war crimes. There is such thing as war crimes. There is such thing as right and wrong in war. It's not okay to do anything in war. And one of the keys is you can't directly aim at civilians. If you are attacking a tank factory and there are civilians nearby, when the factory blows up, it destroys some of their buildings. That is not considered a war crime. It's collateral damage. But a nuclear exchange, you're killing everybody. And thinkers like Niebuhr would say that is unchristian. Um, that's a war crime. That we cannot allow that. So he pushed against this, and we're going to have a second campaign challenging the policy in the early '80s when the Soviets move some nuclear weapons in to directly threaten Europe, and then Ronald Reagan moves some medium range weapons into Europe, and there's going to be protests both in America and in Europe. Um, so how do we look at this? I don't know the answer. On the one hand, I hear what Niebuhr was saying. It's not okay to aim at civilians. On the other hand, it worked. We didn't we didn't have war with the Soviet Union. It actually kept the peace. And if you look at what Stalin had been willing to do, and the people who followed Stalin did some horrible stuff too. Um, are you really convinced the Soviets wouldn't have nuked us if they thought they could have gotten away with it? If we didn't have nuclear bombs, just if we get rid of ours, does that mean the Soviets are going to get rid of theirs? We had people talking like that earlier in the 20th century. You had people saying, as the Nazis were rising, okay, top intellectuals in Europe saying, and I'm almost directly quoting this, what we need to do is completely disarm and let the Nazis do their worst. And then that will be a move for peace. Maybe we'll influence them, but just peace at all cost. And then Europe found out there are some things worse than war, like the Holocaust. Um, and many of those same people ended up trying to join the resistance. Well, when Europe disarmed in front of the Nazis just viewed it as appeasement and went to war. If we had completely gotten rid of our nukes, I'm not convinced the Soviets wouldn't be willing to invade or even use their nukes if they didn't think we'd use it back. Um, so the deterrence of MAD did keep the peace. I hear Niebuhr's argument about how that itself is uncivilized. I don't know how to solve that problem. Remember, in the real world, sometimes it's not, so I do believe in absolutes. There is right and wrong. Sometimes I don't know what the right is. Um, okay, so make sure you understand the debate about the morality of nuclear weapons. And again, the big concern people have today, excuse me, is what if people like North Korea get nuclear bombs? That maybe they can't be deterred. With the Soviet Union, they actually, or didn't want to be destroyed and didn't want to die. But if the leader of North Korea thinks he's going to die, I wouldn't put it past him to not care if his whole country goes up in a ball of flames. Some worry about maybe Iran getting a nuclear bomb, and that the fear that their leaders would feel they're doing their people a favor if they bring the whole country to die for their cause. Um, so that deterrence worked with the Soviet Union because those communists, they don't believe in life after death. They think I want to live, and so we were able to deter them. But the problem is, could you deter North Korea and Iran? And so nobody wants Iran to get a nuclear bomb. How we prevent it, that's where the big debate comes. And so you've got different ideas about how we discourage Iran from getting a nuke. But both sides of political aisles are worried about that happening. Okay. So a point I was about to get to, but I left it for now. The potential for nuclear armed confrontation with the Soviet Union underlay every element of American foreign policy from World War II to 1991. Why? Well, every time we get into an engagement, we have to be careful that we're not going to push this into an all-out war. And if we're fighting one of the Soviet's allies, we have to be worried that we're going to bring them in. And if it escalates, they might go nuclear. So you've got people like MacArthur later saying there's no substitute for victory. It's victory or nothing. Um, but the problem was, when he's saying this in the Korean War, the problem is if we escalate too much, would the Soviet Union come in and then would we both lose our nukes? And that's just unthinkable. So it's going to limit our options much more and constrain us in our decisions when it comes to strategies we're going to follow in every war, particularly Korea and Vietnam. Um, but again, um, it may have actually led to more peace. The existence of nukes may have actually led to more peace between the Soviet Union and America than if there hadn't been nukes, because both sides are afraid of ultimate destruction. Oh, and one more thing to think about. Uh, I gotta find some resources. I remember running across this. I gotta find some sources before I say it absolutely. But I remember reading about actually the Soviet Union funding um, protests against our nukes, and but when the Soviets increased their nuclear weapons, were people allowed to protest in the Soviet Union? Now, if you protest over there, you disappear. So we're not playing on a level playing field. Okay, so that's enough for this lecture. Next time, we will talk about the times where the Cold War goes hot. Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. This is where a lot of people are going to die, but we're ending up Americans and the Soviets are killing our enemies through third party countries.